Okay, so Professor Willis, thank you very much for this opportunity. To our audience, Professor Ray Willis is the Managing Director of Future Smart Strategies. Is that also, as well as an expert on sustainability in the world. And today we want to have a conversation with him and get his perspective on the whole sustainability ecosystem. So Professor Willis, the very first question I want to ask is, to your point of view, what is sustainability and why is it relevant for us today?
Look, sustainability is a concept that continues to evolve, and all concepts should always evolve. Sustainability, in a nutshell, in my view, is about doing more with less. It's about ensuring that we don't waste resources, that we continue to improve our ability to do the things that we need to do and to do the things that we wish to do, but without spoiling the planet. Clearly, there's longer definitions than that, but I think that's the simplest. It's actually ensuring that, for me, the planet is a better place tomorrow than it was today because of my own actions. Okay.
You also describe yourself as a futurist. I don't know, who is a futurist?
Look, it's an interesting term. I think a futurist is a term that should be ascribed, not necessarily claimed. But I've been described as a futurist often enough now that I believe I can repeat the term without embarrassment. A futurist is somebody that looks at the way that the world is changing, that markets are changing, that our communities and societies are changing, and sees what direction that's going in. And there are many dancers in the world, there are many singers in the world, some of them are good, some of them are not so good. The art of a good futurist is to be the least wrong. The principle there is to understand the trends that are happening and then being able to translate that as to what the next things that will happen will be. So very often we talk about futurists in relation to particularly technology, but I define technology very broadly. Technology is anything that we do, and whether that's a TV set, or whether it's the way we record music, or whether it's the way that we play a game. All of those things are around technology that we invent as humans, and the ability of a futurist is to say, what will be the next thing that we do for playing sport in a stadium, or what is the next thing that we'll do for telecommunications, or what is the next thing that we'll do for energy?
Okay, so on that note, as a futurist, what do you see in the energy space? What are the changes that you see in our energy space going forward?
Certainly this century is very much changing. Obviously, last century we made energy in a particular way, and we made it in a particular way that required a fuel source, and that fuel source invariably has carbon in it. And whether that's been oil or gas or coal or wood, or any other of our combustible materials that we use generally to either light a fire or to boil some water, or to turn a turbine and create steam and to turn a turbine to create electricity. All of those sources of water generally have had, or source of energy have generally had carbon involved. The exciting thing and the different thing about this century is that we're removing the fuel sources, we're removing the carbon, and in part, in many places, we're removing the thermal source of creating energy to convert that from turbines that just create electricity directly from wind, and of course, solar panels that create electricity directly from light. So it's a very different way of creating energy. And this century has obviously seen significant change in both wind and solar, and the last decade has seen substantial change in both wind and solar as we've taken that up. But now, more particularly, this decade is the exciting one. This decade is the one when the real change occurs. Last decade, I like to refer to as a practice match. This one is the one we're going to play the real tournament.
Okay. So do you have some data to back what you are saying? I'm saying this because in my part of the world, which is Africa, a lot of these changes in our work as AfricaNEV, when we talk to people, they think that, oh, these things would, yes, it will come and it will happen, but in Africa, it will take maybe 10, 20, 30 years before we begin to feel the impact.
Yeah.
So I would like to know from your experience, what did you expect in the past, let's say for the last decade, or even going back 20 years? What was your expectations and how did that match up to the reality that you experienced? And then going forward, how does that inform your predictions, if you will, in this space, or for this space?
Yeah, I mean, a good futurist must have the most recent data. The models and projections that they rely on must be understanding what changed, not just last year, but last week and yesterday, and translating that into what actually happened today, and then ensuring that you can then start to make projections about what will happen tomorrow. As I said, the art of a good futurist is to be the least wrong. Nobody can tell the future, not even a futurist. But what we can do is, with good data, can inform ourselves as to what is the most likely outcome. Probability plays a role. In the past decade and a half that I've been involved in this space, and in particular where my projections I've started making public since about 2012, I've done pretty well. 75% of the projections that I've released over the last 8 years have been within 10% of actual numbers when I look back in 2020 and say, this is what 2015 and 2016 was going to happen in 2012. And I've mostly got it right. Occasionally I've got it spectacularly wrong. Occasionally, but, getting it spectacularly wrong is okay if you immediately correct the way that your model works, and that you immediately start to correct the projections. So you revise projections every year, and you admit when you're wrong, and you actually claim when you're right. The things that I got spectacularly wrong relate to the uptake of electric cars. Initially, I thought it would be a bit slower than it was back in 2014. And then 2015, I got a bit cocky, so I thought it was going to be faster than it was. But by 2016, my numbers have been quite good. And indeed, the projections I was making in 2016 and 2017 within within about 10%, which is the number that I like to think that I can get to. So, for example, I was forecasting that there'd be 2.2 million cars in the world by 2019. I was a little bit wrong. It was only 2.1. So okay. I was just a little. Yeah. Now, occasionally when you make projections like that, or more than occasionally, people think you're a little bit nuts. You're a little bit crazy. And part of the reason why most people get the projections of the future wrong is that they look at the future in a linear way. We all think that the future is somehow just a linear translation of what happened.
Yeah.
I've got a good friend who refers to the Excel spreadsheet, and he says that those that are making those kinds of projections are Excel spreadsheet drag right. You've got a couple of numbers, you simply drag along the column, and when you've dragged along the column, you've come up with a result. That's not modelling, that's not projections, that's simply saying nothing changes, everything stays the same. If the growth rate is, and it's always 2%, that's just nonsense. When something succeeds, it doesn't grow in a linear fashion, it grows in an exponential fashion, and it goes off the top of the screen. And there's several economic theories and operational theories that explain why that happens. Things like Rogers S-curve and things like Wright's law are all appropriate to the translation of how many widgets become more widgets, how many telephones become more telephones, and how many electric cars become more electric cars. And anybody that, whenever you see a graph that simply is a linear translation into the distance, those folk really don't know what they're saying. They're just doing an Excel spreadsheet, drag right.
I want to share something. This is your work. We actually use it as part of a presentation of ours. Like I said, do follow you closely.
I'm sometimes very noisy, so I apologize for that.
Can you see? Can you see? This is you.
Yeah.
Is this what
this
you're?
Is one of my projections from.
Okay.
The solar lines on there for wind and solar are blue, and what you can see is that back in 2019, when I released this projection, although it didn't change much from the previous ones for wind and solar, you can see that there was, I projected a crossover in 2019 of solar capacity being higher than wind. In 2020, I can tell you that that's true. That actually happened.
Sorry.
We've got slightly more predictions. Oh, that's a great shot too. But what you also see is that wind started to emerge in the first decade of this century. Solar didn't really emerge until the second decade, last decade, into high capacity growth. But what I'm saying with all of my forecasts is last decade was just a practice match. Solar really gets going this decade. Wind too actually starts to grow faster than it has before. But what gets even faster is the adoption of batteries.
Okay, and batteries is a big one. But I wanted to know, like for Australia. So as you predicted, and then you started seeing in Australia, I know that your policy framework does not particularly support renewables. Your government is very pro-coal and all that. So what is driving the adoption of solar in Australia? Is it, in what market? Is it the grid-scale solar system that you are seeing, or commercial scale, or residential?
The early adoption in Australia was backed by government, and so therefore there were good policies in the 2000s for the adoption of renewables. Although those governments didn't actually understand, I don't think, exactly what consequences their backing renewables would have, which was good, strong growth in Australia. Throughout the last decade, we've referred to Australian policy as the solar coaster. Instead of a roller coaster, it was a solar coaster. One year we'd have great support for renewables and we'd be going right up a high rise. And then the next year it was down the solar coaster. And so therefore we've had inconsistent whole time. So it has actually moderated growth in Australia. Australia would have much more solar if that policy had remained consistent. But the real reason that in the last few years that solar is simply going forward in Australia is because of economics. Solar is now simply the cheapest product that you can use to generate electricity. You could build a coal-fired power station new and it will not be as cheap as a solar power station new. You can build a gas-fired power station new and it won't be as cheap as solar. And so what's happening now is the economics are really starting to cut in. And that's fantastic news commercially for Australia. It's fantastic for industries within Australia who are looking to do even more work in that space.
Okay.
But even better news for Africa, because what's now happening is that the reason that solar will get even faster is because it will be even cheaper again. And it means that of anyone that builds any energy form throughout this decade, their very first port of call, their very first consideration will no longer be a fossil fuel. It will be a renewable energy and very likely solar. But just as equally, wind remains competitive and in the right circumstances, wind is a better outcome.
Okay.
What we still face, the reason for the acceleration of battery growth, which I'm sure you'd like to get to as well, but I'll just touch on it now, is that obviously we also need reliability as well as value for money. And what batteries will do and what batteries will bring is the reliability to the provision of energy services that we simply can't get with intermittent generation. The sun goes down at night, that's a problem. Not necessarily, we like to sleep as well. and the wind often blows strongly, but sometimes it won't blow. We need to be able to have circumstances to meet demand for electricity when the solar is not working or the wind is not working, sometimes both. And for that, batteries will provide the solution.
So in Australia, is it that most of the solar systems have batteries backing them up, or is just the solar system alone?
Yeah, so there you can see that the curve on that particular graph we've got at the moment shows the emergence of batteries happening in 2019. And sure enough, last year in Australia, batteries did start to emerge both globally and also particularly for Australia. And in 2018, of course, yeah, if you've heard of the big battery, the big
Hornsdale.
Tesla battery in Australia.
Good. We are about to talk about that.
Yeah, so that was the first big utility scale battery that Australia had, and it was a great big battery, and it's done a superb job, and it's given a fantastic return on investment for those that spent money to build it, are getting a remarkable return on investment for the money they spent. They're actually receiving good rewards, because those that were skeptical thought that batteries wouldn't work. Those that were skeptical thought that batteries might work but wouldn't be economic. And gee, they've worked really well, and they've been extraordinarily price competitive.
Now that you have opened the battery can of worms, let's go there. For the Hornsdale battery, in our part of the world, let me show you something. Okay, this is Ghana, my country.
Yep.
All right. You can see our energy consumption.
Years ago, and you know, I understand Ghana a little as far as the energy profile is concerned. So, and I'm also pleased to say that I've had a PhD student from Ghana who's just finished his PhD. So congratulations to Basil while we're online.
Okay, his name is what? What's his full name? Hello?
Sorry?
Your student, you use his full name.
Oh, sorry. I'm Basil Amuzi Safordzi.
Okay.
I don't.
I know you're not pronouncing it correctly, but well, congratulations to him.
Let's link that later. But he's online. He's on Twitter as well.
Okay. So now, if you look at our energy distribution, this is from our regulator. You can see how our energy distribution goes. So we have electricity generation, we have petroleum, then we have biomass. The biomass is mainly for cooking. 80% of the biomass is firewood, and then 20% is charcoal for cooking. And the petroleum, most of it is for transportation. Now, the electricity is where I want us to focus on for now. You see that for our generation capacity, 60% is thermal, and then 40% is hydro.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in Australia, when you started using this Hornsdale battery reserve, how did it affect your pickup power plant regime? And how can that apply to a country like ours, where most of our capacity is thermal? So
two parts to that, of course. Now, the primary role that the Hornsdale battery has had has been for ancillary services, for balancing and for control of voltage and hertz, particularly frequency control. And that part of the market traditionally has relied on our baseload power, or indeed our spinning reserve. The reserve has very often been used to provide those two services. Okay. But what we discovered is that once we introduced the battery was very capable of really quick responses. And so that provided a rapid response. And then the second thing we discovered is that as well as those ancillary services, it could actually provide some instant load as well in microsecond response time. So it was far more responsive than, for example, a fast startup gas turbine might have been, which is usually perhaps 2 or 3 seconds. It's far faster than coal, which is measured in minutes, not seconds. And it's also far faster than even diesel gensets, which sometimes can be measured in seconds, 1 or 2 seconds as well. So the ability of the battery to respond rapidly has not only helped in terms of frequency control, but on some rare occasions where we've had major outages of generation, it's taken up the gap that was provided, has simply filled that gap with available energy. And that too has been extraordinary. And in the balancing markets and the frequency markets, where occasionally those prices could spike up to $14,000 a megawatt hour, what we're seeing now with the Hornsdale battery in place is that the highest price spikes are now seldom over $1,000 a megawatt hour. Now, those episodes are fairly rare, but what the Hornsdale battery has made them is almost extinct. And that means that that's cheap prices for those in the market. Now, the question you asked was, how does that relate to Ghana and thermal power production? The first is that a battery can protect you from outages to do with that thermal generation. But more particularly, not yet, but as batteries get cheaper and we actually use batteries more and more for energy arbitrage, that is energy in, energy out, storing when we've got high points and sending it back to market when we've got low points. That really requires batteries to be really cheap. But when we get there, even a thermal power station can benefit from a battery, because what you can start to do is, instead of having your thermal power station cycle up and cycle down with load, you can actually run your thermal power station optimally, which means you'll burn less fuel, you'll save money, and use the battery to do the highs and lows in the energy demand. And that provides a far better result for the grid. So batteries are still absolutely useful for a fossil fuel burning thermal network. It will reduce emissions on that network, because the thermal network will in fact be more efficient and can run at its highest efficiency. But really, the best thing we can do with batteries, of course, is to plug them into renewables. So there's good scope for Ghana to do things with batteries, even with thermal power. But of course, the rational thing to do is to start making more use of the hydro resources that Ghana does have, both in terms of pumping and pump storage, but also ultimately in using that hydro then as a backup for much higher penetration of solar and renewables, and using that as your first battery, your cheapest battery, because it's already built, but then subsequently starting to add additional electrical storage through electric batteries. And that can very naturally happen over the next several years, and in my view, will be extraordinarily affordable by no later than 2025.
Good. Fantastic. Now, when it comes to the batteries, we do know that there are 3 important metrics for us: the energy density, the cycle time, and the costs per kilowatt hour. Currently, where is the price, the cost per kilowatt hour when it comes to batteries, and where does it need to be to make, let's say, electric vehicles and even these independent generation models, where people have a solar panel and a battery in their house, more affordable for the average African or individual anywhere in the world?
Yeah. Look, so what's happening here is, if we think about our most expensive form of electricity in terms of a mobile phone, a mobile phone comes with a battery, but if we actually price the cost of the battery in the mobile phone to to how much that then translates to in a cost per unit for the electricity that we use. It's a really expensive way to use electricity. We like a mobile phone battery to last a long time, so that we get plenty of talk time and plenty of time to use our apps if we've got access to the internet. And the consequence of that is that we tend to ignore the fact that that electricity is actually really expensive, but it's also because there's not a meter attached to the phone necessarily. So we don't see we're paying in US dollars probably about $1.25, $1.30 a kilowatt hour for the electricity in that phone. When we take that battery and start to put it into something that burns electricity, like it burns fuel like a motor car, even a motor car is reasonably energy intensive, and the energy we put into it can be actually quite expensive. In US dollar terms, the petrol in a car is worth about 30 or 40 US cents a kilowatt hour. So it's quite dear.
30 cents.
And so when we actually escalate, we produce a lot of mobile phones, but when you actually add them all up, yeah, it's a lot of batteries. There's about 7 gigawatt hours of batteries in iPhones alone. There's about 20 gigawatt hours of storage in all of our mobile devices that are phones and iPads and those sorts of tablet devices. Still not a lot of batteries. We're already up to 60 or 70 gigawatt hours now in motor cars alone, and we've only been producing electric vehicles for a couple of years, and we've been producing mobile phones for many years. So what cars are doing for us as we create electric cars are doing two things that all economists love, and one is scale and the other one is volume. You need to be able to scale up your production to reduce costs, and volume, the more volume you make, the lower your costs become. The more electric cars we make, the lower the cost of batteries become. And what we have to beat is that 30 to 40 cent kilowatt hour price point is to do that. Most of electricity generation is much cheaper than that. So batteries automatically tap into a fuel source of 15 cents US or so, even cheaper sometimes. They tap into a fuel source that's much, much cheaper than gasoline. Yeah. So electric cars already have a price advantage in terms of operation. We've got to get them to a price advantage in terms of affordability, in terms of that upfront capital cost. But the next thing that you need to do to make batteries and storage cheap, to answer your question, is we've then got to bring batteries that we can plug in at home to be cheaper again. To get to that point, we need volume and scale, and we're just fortunate that electric cars, which cars previously have had a more expensive energy source, therefore electrification is attractive, therefore volume and scale starts to play. It starts to bring down the price of batteries. And so the next step we can use batteries for is stationary storage, storage at home, storage at work, large scale utility storage for energy generation, or smaller scale storage for us at home in a village, at home in either a fancy house or a simple house. And we can start to power devices with those batteries. But we really want those batteries to be cheap to make it affordable. Here in Australia, we like them to be cheap. In Africa, in many circumstances, we need them to be cheaper again to provide the best outcome for the populations in villages. And that's happening. And we're getting on that journey because mobile phones started us on that journey. We needed good energy storage, good energy density. Electric cars want both the same things, but they also want the batteries to be much cheaper. And homes want the same thing, but they want the batteries to be cheaper again.
Okay. When you listen to Elon Musk's talk, and I've actually listened to another guy, I forgot his name, who is into the storage space. They keep saying that the world needs terawatt hours of storage, but currently the world produces gigawatt hours. How long do you think it will take for the supply to catch up to that pent-up demand?
So one of the things that people forget when they talk about electric vehicles, and even perhaps in Elon's case, is that they forget that we use batteries in many, many different things, not just the mobile phones, but also, other devices that are a little bit odd. But we use them in playstations and gaming stations. We use them in torches and radios. We've been using batteries for a long, long time. And as batteries get cheaper, we find new places to use them. If we ignore electric cars for the moment, last year's production, 2019 production of batteries, was around about 280 gigawatt hours.
Whoa.
So that was a substantial amount of battery. You start to add electric cars to that, and you start to see much more substantial gain in batteries. So we've been increasing the rate of battery production by 30 and 40% per annum. That's production. Electric cars are making that go even faster. And one of the reasons that we're suddenly seeing an expansion of battery factory production is, of course, because of the car industry.
Yes.
The first big announcements about electrification of cars and vehicles was in 2018, when the world realised that Tesla were going to start delivering, and the rest of the car industry went, okay, we need to build electric cars too. We're going to try and do that by 2025. So we're going to start to announce investments. In 2018 alone, the whole car industry announced $350 billion of investments into electric cars by 2025. In 2019, another $100 billion was added to that number. And in the last 3 months, 2.5 months, 3 months of this year, we've actually seen a further $50 billion added. So far, the world's announced $500 billion of investments in electric cars. And what that has meant is that people that build battery factories are going, well, this is a good idea. Let's build some more factories. So what we're seeing is that it takes around, and as Elon Musk is demonstrating, it takes around 2 years to put a factory together that's then capable of output. It's not that long. You might add a little bit of planning in advance of that, but it's much less than 3 years to really get your skates on, to really get going fast, and to start building a factory that can make batteries. The second thing that we know is that, and now the world wants lots of batteries. So there's really no competition in battery factories. Everybody that builds one is going to be able to sell their batteries. So that's rule number 2. So the next thing that we then know is that as we expand, we get even more announcements. It's actually really easy to get to 2025 and actually have enough batteries coming out of factories to build every car in the world, 80 million cars a year, as electric, if only we get on with it. And pretty much the announcements are that we are getting on with it. We're seeing every month there's a new battery factory announcement somewhere, sometimes not as big as the gigafactories that Elon Musk is talking about, but still much bigger than the factories we were only talking about years ago. So every announcement is a bigger factory.
Okay. Now let's talk about the car industry. What is happening globally? Will you say it is a transition or a disruption? Or maybe first of all, what is a disruption? What is a disruption, a technology disruption?
A disruption is when you start doing similar tasks with technology that's completely different, and that makes that task so much easier. So, the Industrial Revolution introducing steam in substitute for human labour, for human energy to do jobs, was a disruption. We changed the way that we worked and so on. And the disruption can be within a small sector, can be something that's not as huge, but when we start talking about transport, the disruption that's really coming isn't so much the electrification of cars, which is causing a substantial change in the car industry because we're changing the way that we put energy into a car. But at the end of the day, it's still mostly a car. A lot of people say it's actually now a computer on wheels because of all the other things that we're going to do. The other things are probably more important than the electrification. Electrification is a symptom of all the change that's going on, but the greatest change will come with vehicle autonomy, with the ability of vehicles to drive themselves. And that is a far bigger disruption. But the thing that's perplexing us is that the arrival of electrification and the arrival of autonomy is happening together,
Simultaneously.
but they're unrelated technologies. So what we're seeing is that the electrification's got everybody excited about autonomy. And so there's a lot of people thinking, well, if I want an autonomous car, it needs to be electric. It doesn't really, but don't tell anybody. But what we do know is that the addition of higher levels of driver assistance, we go into, you know, the early stages of driver assistance is things like adaptive cruise control that will make sure that you don't crash into the vehicle in front of you when you're driving along, lane warning that will make sure that you don't spin off the road, emergency braking because you didn't see the car stop in front of you. That's just level 1 stuff. And that's now available virtually in every car produced in the world. Not necessarily as a standard feature, but certainly in most cars produced in the world today, if you want those things, you can actually get them as an option. You'll pay a bit extra, but you'll get them as an option in your car. Some places, they work really well where you've got freeways to drive down. If you're driving down a road, they will still stop for an elephant, I understand. So, you know, there are certain measures that these things do have utility to. But like all things of new technology always starts in the most expensive goods. If we focus on the car industry and we think, where was the first airbag? It was in a BMW. And it was a BMW that I can't afford to buy. You know, it was the expensive end of the BMW range. But as we produced the technology better and that technology increased in volume and the costs came down, they started to make it into the mid-price cars. And then finally, governments realised that this technology is really saving lives. So we're going to insist that actually every car maker has to include an airbag in their car. And virtually every car in the world produced today now has an airbag. The reason for that is that, first of all, it got cheap. And then secondly, governments went, well, that's cheap and it saves lives, therefore every car should have one. We'll see the same with other systems like, you know, seat belts and braking systems and so on. And this adaptive cruise control, I'm pretty confident in a few years' time, governments will say, actually, every car must have that because it will save lives. And the next thing that will happen after that is, as we get to autonomous vehicles, governments will recognise that people are really, really bad drivers and that it's really better that the cars drive themselves and that we're not in charge. That might be a few further years down the track. But nevertheless, right now, all of that technology is emerging in the expensive end of the market, but volume and scale comes along, it reduces the cost, it makes it more affordable into the lower end vehicles until at such time as it will simply be the thing that we do. And that's sometimes how disruptions happen. Disruptions can happen very naturally because we simply want that new mobile device and everybody buys one. We didn't need governments to regulate that we had to have mobile phones, and now we realise that they're a really big pain to us, but nevertheless we all have them. But in some other circumstances, governments will grab a hold of a new technology and say, that will save lives. Why are governments interested in saving lives? Because it saves their budget. The treasurer of the country will say, the fewer people in the hospital, the lower our health budget is, and it's mostly governments that spend money on health budgets. So they're really interested in saving our lives so they can spend less money on us. And that's a part of this. But nevertheless, it's also a good driver. It comes with a good outcome. If only we were more important.
I want to ask you, is the car industry in trouble? The reason why I'm asking that is because January of this year, Hebedis gave his now infamous or famous, depending on your point of view, fire speech, where he's basically said that the legacy ICE vehicles are dead. We've seen a number of car companies scrambling. Toyota, that has been famously anti-electric vehicles, is announcing a battery joint venture with Panasonic. Yesterday, or was that 2 days ago, GM basically did an EV day, trying to convince the whole world that they are serious about electric vehicles. Ford had to invest in Rivian. It seems that everywhere you look, almost every serious car company is scrambling to put their EV program or appear to be doing something electric. Meanwhile,
Yep.
as we talk now, electric cars represent just 2%, roughly, of the total car market. Why the mass scramble?
So the key here has been, I guess, a couple of things. Certainly, there's been some economic measures that have reduced the sale of cars in the last year or two. Prior to that, we had the crisis with the Dieselgate scandal and with the way that car companies were actually falsifying information. So that started to erode brand trust in some of the bigger brands. And then they had to start to respond, particularly because they were manufacturers from Europe. They had to convince the European Union that they were doing the right thing as far as air pollution standards were concerned and about carbon emission standards were concerned. So Dieselgate became an example of, in terms of the erosion of sales of diesel, became an example of how car companies could very quickly lose a market share. And so they had to start thinking more, because they could no longer fiddle the books and come up with a fake number. They now had to produce a real number. It put pressure back on them to accelerate their emissions reductions program for their vehicle fleet. But at the same time, Musk came along. Musk came along and proved that the Model S worked well, the Model X works well, and then he started talking about the Model 3, which we've got to remember is, only been out for 18 months. It's a really new phenomenon. But once it hit the market, people said, well, I can't afford that, but I can now see that electric cars are real. I can now see that electric cars will be able to work. And we didn't need the whole population to recognise that, or not even the half the population to recognise that. We simply needed a small percentage of the population to recognise that, and that small percentage to stop buying the traditional vehicles. And the circumstances that the car industry found themselves in, with erosion over Dieselgate, with a little bit of erosion over economic conditions, and then with a little bit of excitement about electric vehicles, each one of those little percentage cuts meant that car sales kept on dropping. And what we know now is that since the end of 2017
was 100 million
was
cars, right?
peak car.
100 million cars.
Well, we're approaching about 92, 93 million vehicles, and it's only fallen since 2017. 2018 was smaller than 2017, and 2019 was smaller than 2018. So the car industry itself is having a few shocks. The next thing the car industry will say to the world is, car sales are slipping because of the coronavirus. Yeah, we might see a bit of slippage there, absolutely. But it will be the next excuse the car industry uses, instead of saying electrification is the next big thing. We're kind of getting past that now, but I'd say this will be the last time the car industry blames anything but electrification. And then we'll get used to electric cars. Now, the second part that we tend to miss is that while Musk is dominating the planet in the Western world as far as car sales, electric car sales are concerned, the rate of growth in China is just extraordinary.
Wow.
And the number of models that are available in China is just extraordinary. And China have been trying to break into the conventional car market without success. What I believe China is doing strategically is to rapidly build its capability in electric car manufacture, and then use that as its entry point to get to the global car market. So what we'll see over the course of this year and next year is the release of many of the Chinese electric car models that are not yet available globally. They will start to be released, and that will have a new second impact on the erosion of the sale of combustion cars. That's great news from a number of fronts, one of the most important of which is affordability. The Chinese cars are not going to be Tesla priced, and so therefore they're going to be much more affordable to the global community. And when that happens, anybody that tries to build a combustion engine and sell it to you will be in the same place that somebody that builds coal-fired power stations and trying to sell you one today, when solar panels are available, they just won't sell a coal-fired power station. And in a few years' time, you simply won't sell a combustion engine. People won't want to buy it.
But you know,
and that'll be a bigger force.
whilst that is going on, you see that Africa, and I would say the rest of the developing world, our situation seems to be a bit more interesting. So let's say for the example of the car industry, we know that 30% is China, 22% is Europe,
Yep.
and 17% is the Americas. Okay. Of course, the Chinese are aggressively using policy to drive adoption. The Europeans are using these regulations of the pollution gases. America, because Tesla is there. Now, what you begin to see is that the European car companies, to me, appear to be finding a way to shift their internal combustion engine technologies to places like Africa. So a number of, in my country, for example, a number of car companies have announced these small scale SKD assembly plants. Toyota have announced saying, VW has announced saying, and it's not only Ghana, but a number of African countries that they have picked. So it seems that they are trying to find a way to export their petrol and diesel cars to us. Whilst, because of regulation, they are being forced to sell electric in Europe and America and China. Now, with the supply of these Chinese electric vehicles that you see, do you think such a policy, such a strategy will work in the short to medium term?
I'll just repeat that last part of the question again.
Saying that with the flood of Chinese electric vehicles, that very soon they will start exporting to the global market. Do you think the strategy of these European companies, where they are trying to set up assembly plants here for petrol and diesel cars, do you think it's a workable strategy, medium to long term? Will it be successful?
Yeah, look, I think that's the key. Is that there's so many fronts on which the car companies are fighting battles for market share that they really need to be concerned about what they're not seeing. And what they're not seeing is the Chinese coming. And the there will be how quickly they can assemble factories and bring factories. I think there's a grand opportunity for Africa to actually start manufacturing plants either with car makers, with conventional car makers, or with new car makers. And at the same time, because Africa as a continent has, and of course Africa is many nations, so it's always difficult for many nations to do this thing that the whole of the continent ought to be. But Africa as a continent, like Australia, is also the shopping basket for materials for batteries. All of the materials you need to make a battery you can find here where I am in Western Australia in the ground. The same is absolutely true throughout Africa. The oldest parts of Africa are away from the fault lines on the flat zones. Has great mineral resources and metal resources that can provide the first elements that you need to make a battery, that you need the battery to put into the electric car, and all the materials around building in a car are also there. So there's some logic in that full supply chain, thinking about Australia as a destination or thinking about Africa as a destination. Far better than building them in Europe, far better than even building them in America. China has quite a good resource base, but still not as good as Australia, still not as good as Africa. If the African nations can actually coordinate to deliver that supply chain themselves, there is a wonderful opportunity for them to capture some downstream value adding in the nations that are capable of hosting that manufacturing capability. And Ghana would be one of those. And so too Kenya, and so too Nigeria, and so too South Africa. There's a number of the strong nations in Africa that are capable of delivering that. It's really then a question of how do you make sure that you can use that to the advantage of each of the nations in Africa, and also as a unified group of nations as a continent of Africa. That'd be an amazing outcome. It'd be an amazing outcome because it can be done with renewable energy, and it can be done with heightened sustainability, and it can be done in a way that would lift many people out of poverty as a consequence of that economic activity, and as a consequence of economic activity that doesn't necessarily need to cost the earth. It doesn't necessarily need to be unsustainable. I'm drifting a long way from my question. I'm just getting onto
No. Please flow.
But coming back to the point, though, the key here is the European nations are indeed, strongly present in Africa, and you'll know much more about that than I will. But I'm certainly aware of the intent, certainly in West African nations, of countries like Germany having a very strong presence and an active presence in terms of promoting business opportunities. I'm still drifting a long way from the question. The question is, what can Africa do? I think ultimately one of the challenges for Australia now is that Australia no longer builds cars. We had a car industry, but it couldn't compete. Whereas Africa's got a new opportunity to create a car industry, and in particular because Europeans may not be used to building cars for African conditions. Americans might not be used to building cars for African and Australian conditions, which can be very similar. Dry and hot and dusty, rocky roads, necessarily, not necessarily all beautiful long highways. Occasionally we have to go off-road and get dirty. And that's true in Australia, and that's true in Africa when we have remote locations that have people living there, and we have remote that need vehicles to drive them. So a lot of what the world is building may not necessarily be African or Australian. And that's another part of the challenge. The interesting thing I see, though, is that Africa does seem to have, in different nations, growing car industry and some growing local manufacture. Obviously, there are the foreign units that are in places like South Africa building where VW is good, but it's a good time. I don't know enough to be dangerous. I don't know enough to solve the problem.
Okay. Well, in terms of our market size, Africa, we are like 1% of the global market when it comes to cars. And then, not only that, you see that we are divided into very small, discrete markets. So we have Nigeria, West Africa. Then we have the small countries like us, Ghana and Co. Who Ghana, for example, we import 100,000 cars. The 100,000 cars, 90,000 of them are used. Only 10,000 are new. Okay, but there is this whole West African Continental Free Trade Agreement now that is being implemented. So that will help to unify the market, because it's one of the differences between, let's say, Australia and China, where you have a centralized authority or centralized control. But Africa is not so. Anyway, the last topic I wanted to tackle was with regard to mining. You alluded to it in your area.
If I can interrupt you before you go there, because one of the interesting things is New Zealand's car market. New Zealand has more electric cars than Australia. Australia has a total of a fleet of 18 million vehicles, and right now, in the last 12 months, we've sold around about 17,000 electric cars in Australia. Still a very tiny number. But New Zealand, which has a quarter the size of the population, a quarter the size of the car market, now has 20,000 electric vehicles. And they did that through second-hand imports from Japan. So they were bringing in second-hand electric vehicles instead of new ones, trying to be more affordable. And so, it strikes me that there's probably an opportunity to do that, to do that in some places as well, to bolster the growth rate of. But that's a longer conversation. Let me go back to your question that you were about to ask that I interrupted you.
Okay, well, now that you raised that, I also wanted to ask something else again. You know, there are about 2.5 billion petrol cars in the world today, currently. What do you think will happen?
About 1.4 billion. 1.4
1.4 billion. Okay. Yeah. What will happen to them when people realize that it doesn't make sense to drive these cars because the electric car is so much cheaper to operate and decide to pack it? What will happen to all those cars?
Turmoil. There'll be some good outcomes for some people who would like to buy a new petrol car and get it very cheaply, and they'll be able to do that and buy that car much cheaper than it used to be, either because either the new cars aren't selling, so therefore the car companies will look to sell them more cheaply, or alternatively, the second-hand cars will get cheaper because more and more people will be buying electric cars. So that comment I made about the New Zealand car market actually becomes relevant. There will be, I think, some heightened trade of second-hand vehicles as we move them from places that have good electricity infrastructure, and so therefore electric cars are easy, to places that have less ideal electric infrastructure where charging electric cars will be a little more difficult. I don't think my view is that by 2026, the world will no longer be building combustion engine cars. But that doesn't mean that we won't be selling combustion engine cars. It's just that they'll be a year or 2 or 4 or 5 years old. And so that market will get cheap very quickly. The next challenge is how long will they last? And they'll last a long time because they're a motor car and they can last 10 and 20 years. The real question is, how long will the fuel supply last? And once we see an erosion of more than about 10% of that petrol market, we'll start to see the petrol market start to change. Firstly, petrol will get cheaper, gasoline will get cheaper because there'll be an oversupply, but then consumption will start to fall, and so naturally prices will start to bound back as people use less of it and it's less available, then the cost will go up. That's a very difficult scenario to predict because there'll be too many balls in the air. There'll be too much motion to actually work out when prices will go up and go out and go down. All we can safely predict is it will. It'll be very bouncy. It'll be very rough. And to get to that point, there'll be some good opportunities to buy second-hand petrol cars very, very cheaply. And for some places on the earth, that will prove to be a bonus because they'll be able to be used in a way that people didn't imagine. But it will only last for a short time. And by a short time, I mean maybe 5, maybe 10 years.
Wow. You know, you touched on a very serious topic right now, which is the effect of these technologies on the petroleum industry. You know, in Africa, we have some, how do you call it, some countries, like Nigeria, for example, where the economy is basically the petrol industry. What will be the effect on such economies? Because the last oil price collapse, that was, I think, 2015 or so, when the fracking thing collapsed, oil prices to the $30 range. Their economy basically crashed.
Yeah. Look, there'll be absolute problems in the short term for economies that are heavily reliant on oil, whether that be Saudi Arabia or Nigeria, or places that have that oil production.
Angola or even Ghana, because now we also produce oil.
Ghana's offshore oil. Offshore oil, and for those that can produce that oil cheaply because it's shallow, it's easy to access, they will be the most competitive. And for those that are getting deep water oil or oil sand oil, which is expensive to create, they'll be the first to go. How quickly it'll be, my view is it's fairly short term. The consequence of that will be obvious within 5 years and will be played out within 10 years. However, at the same time, those countries that have those resources will be fighting to keep using them. But in a marketplace, you have to have a buyer as well as a seller. And so the threat for those that sell oil is the fact that people will stop buying it. In that circumstance, the countries that have those resources need to think about what else can we do with this stuff. We won't be able to burn it anymore. People don't want the carbon emissions, but we can certainly still convert it into product. We can convert it into plastic, although we're getting a little bit shy on plastic these days too. But we need to think of those value-added ways of using that resource. Burning it, in the end, is the least valuable thing we can do with oil. The question is, what can we make with oil that, number one, is more valuable, and number two, doesn't result in emissions? And if we can work on that outcome, then the other things.
So you are saying that Opel is dead, the cartel is dead.
The cartel is dead, yeah. And when you see the rate at which particularly Saudi Arabia and the Arab Emirates are spending money on sustainable solar energy, they already know it. They already know that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. The Stone Age ended because we found a better solution. The same principle is in the oil industry.
You know, my personal opinion is that this Saudi Aramco IPO was basically a way for them to get extra money so that they can pump as much oil as they can while it lasts. But hey,
it's so that they can get value out of the oil company while the oil company lasts. The value of the oil will go very quickly. Now, it started as a $2 trillion company. The last numbers I saw, it was down to only a $1.8 trillion company. It had lost $200 billion in value in just a few months.
Serious? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it will continue to be a core investment, and it will continue to be the value, the market capitalisation of the company will continue to fall with time, I would predict. And given that the price of oil has just plummeted because of the coronavirus, it will be getting faster than even I might have predicted.
Okay. So we're going to talk about mining when it pertains to Africa. And we realize that all these electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines, all need materials. And like you said, most of the materials can be found here. I always think about cobalt when this whole mining issue comes up. You see that because of the mining practices in the Congo, now everybody wants to use no cobalt at all. However, the African continent is split into disparate countries with wildly different governance structures. We have outright dictatorships to democracies to, all manner of anything in between. How do you think we can position ourselves as a continent to extract maximum value from these new resources that are going to be used more and more to power the 21st century?
The key with many of these technologies is that there's many chemistries. There's many different chemistries a battery can have. And so therefore, actually building batteries with cobalt isn't that hard. If we could get cobalt that was sustainable, that didn't involve child labour, then we wouldn't be looking to use an alternative. So one of the primary challenges internally, especially for the Congo, is to ensure that it can clean up its own industry and do it in a much better way for the whole of the population. And that can be a challenge, of course. It's not easy to fix these things overnight. But if they don't fix them, then the reality will be that we'll find a new way of doing it. There'll be a disruption to a battery technology. We'll build these batteries with different mixes of metals and different mixes of materials. So the same is true whether it be a nickel ion battery or whether it be other chemistries. If we don't manage those supply chains properly, or alternatively, we can't supply sufficiently, then the technologists will turn their mind to solve the problem as to how differently can we do this, what other materials can we use. And that's one is about the supply of materials, and then secondarily, much more importantly today than it has been in the past, is the ethical supply of those materials, of the sustainable supply of those materials. So those things are far more important in 2020 than they were in 2000, way more important in 2020 than they were in 1980. So the reality is the world has changed, and thank goodness. But at the same time, one of the things that's happened with the electrification of vehicles, and so therefore, while cobalt was an issue while we were playing with our mobile phones, it's become a much more significant issue because it's now about clean technology. Mobile phones were never about clean technology. Now motor cars are about clean tech, and so therefore, quite rightly, there's more scrutiny on the source of those materials. And every year that goes by from here on in, that will simply become more true. We will continue to look at more sustainable solutions because the world's largest companies, with the exception of Saudi Aramco, are Apple and Amazon and Google and Microsoft, and they rely on individual customers for their power base. They rely on individual customers for their revenue. And those individual customers, for the most part, are good people. And for the most part, would like to think that they are doing things that will make the planet better. And so for the most part, social media will always naturally drive better outcomes. Occasionally we'll see really bad outcomes when the trolls get out there and cause havoc, but they won't. And the good people of the planet will always, in the end, win out. And consumer democracies and social media are going to allow that to happen more and more, and make it more possible for everybody to have a voice, regardless of whether you're in Australia or in Ghana. And I think that's terrific. That's an amazing outcome, and it's going to get better from here as long as we don't wreck the planet before that happens.
So, one last question: when do you think Australia will have 2% of their cars be electric, as well as Africa? When? By year?
So this year we will hit 2.5%, 3% of car sales in Australia will be electric, and it will just get bigger. 4 or 5% next year, 7 or 8% the year after. It's non-linear growth. It'll just get faster. For Africa, I think Africa has similar challenges to Australia as a whole, in terms of distance and in terms of remoteness. So that means that this first crop of electric cars aren't necessarily fit for purpose, but the next crop will be. Africa and Australia will lag a little bit behind the rest of the world in terms of the uptake of electric vehicles, but only by a year or two, not by 5 years, not by 10 years, only by a year or two.
That is remarkably different from what I hear from industry and policymakers and even individuals here.
The key that changes is that batteries get cheaper, range improves, and we're actually almost at that junction now. And the thing that will prove me right is next year. 2021 or 2022 is the critical 2 years. If my assumptions and my model projections are correct, this is the sweet spot. This is the year that things change, and next year is the year that the change is evident. In 2021, we'll look back at 2020 and say, that's when it happened. We're just about at that point. And so therefore, the truth of my pudding, the proof of my pudding is about to be tested. But so far, I still claim to be the world's least wrong futurist.
I think from what I know, I will agree with that. But Dr. Siba will give you a close round for your money. I am personally looking forward to the Tesla Battery Investor Day. I think that will mark the beginning of the end for a lot of legacy technologies. Professor Willis, thank you very much for having a talk with us. I'm sure that our audience will really, really enjoy this conversation as much as I have. Thank you.
Hopefully we can do it again, and everybody can, of course, find me with my Prof Ray Wills hashtag. Okay,
I think I'll link your Twitter handle below.
Fantastic.
I was even going to ask about the future smart strategies, but we never spoke about it.
Let's talk about it another time. I'll be happy to join you again.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Uru from Australia.
Bye.